Greetings, all. Let's take a few minutes and talk about forecasting. I hope to provide you with a little background, give you some things to think about, and point you in some directions for some additional help. Like just about everything that we cover, forecasting has a very extensive background. It's been in use in businesses and in economics for a very long time. I'm not going to get into the full history of it, but I did find a very nice article from Harvard Business Review from 1971. Chambers and all talk about how to choose the right forecasting technique. And if you go back and you dig up this article, you'll find that a lot of the information that they provide looks like it influences a lot of the textbook treatments that we have today. With being 50 years old, this has got plenty of age on it as well. And obviously the techniques that were discussed in this article didn't have the good luck of the use of computers like we do now, but it does give you a good logical process for choosing forecasting techniques. It talks about a lot of the general categories that we have now, and it provides some fodder for an organizational leader to think about. Now, in particular, in this Chambers et al. Article, they asked three questions, and I think those three questions have stood the test of time very well. They do a good job of helping you focus and pinpoint on what you need to do and how you need to do it. The first question: what is the purpose of the forecast? How is it to be used? That's very important, right? Because the technique that you choose, the type of data that you have to collect, and your ultimate outcomes are very important. Whether you're setting a budget or scheduling staff or preparing a pitch, maybe launching a new product, what you intend to use the forecast for dictates the form and function of it. And so that's something that you really need to put a lot of thought into on the front end. And then ultimately, I think from the Render et al. Text, what they help clear up is the fact that, regardless of the purpose, the reality is you're probably going to use multiple techniques because, ultimately we want to choose the right technique, the one that's going to provide the least amount of error. But having some idea on the front end and having some consideration for that will help. The second component, what are the dynamics and components? Now that assumes that you know what the dynamics and components are, or you can find out, but that will also have a big effect on what you choose. It is what you're wanting to study or what you're wanting to forecast, a seasonal product or service. If so, what is your time frame? Are you going out 6 months? Are you going out a year? Are you going out 2 years? At what point does that season come into effect, right? And we have to think about that. We also have to think about, are we looking at multiple products and services? Are we looking at multiple functions of the business, right? If we're looking at a series of forecasts that are part of a longer process, how does the forecast from one component affect the forecast from another component? And what is the likelihood of error in that? So, depending on the size, the scope, and the complexity of the system that you're trying to forecast, we need to at least put in some diligence to look at what the different components are. And then finally, how important is the past in estimating the future? Number one, right? Do you have past data? If you're launching a new product or a service, if you're an entrepreneur starting your first business, you're not going to have that data, right? So the techniques that you choose are going to have to acknowledge those limitations. The other thing is you may have past data, right? But is it really unusual? Imagine having started a business or ramping up a business in the last 2 years, right? In pandemic times or during a severe economic downturn like we had in the late 2000s. Those those economic circumstances and the unusualness of the context, how does that speak to our forecast and our ability to forecast, right? And then at maybe even a more basic level, it's, do we expect the past to heavily influence the future, right? Do we know that the patterns that we've seen in the past are likely to recur again? Those are questions that you have to ask when you're doing forecasting. And it's important to think about all these things. Now, obviously, if you could do things perfectly, it would be much simpler, but it never hurts to think about what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and what the likely outcomes are. Now, if we jump forward to the current state of the art, right, that Chambers et al. Articles from 1971 has got some good information for us, but we are dealing with some different circumstances now. Maybe back then, forecasting techniques were widespread, but today they are very ingrained in business operations. If you're an organizational leader, if you are an entrepreneur, if you're in some decision making or leadership capacity for an organization, you're expected to understand and be familiar with forecasting techniques. It's not really an option anymore. I don't think you could go to any shareholder or financier or anybody that's a significant shareholder or stakeholder in an organization and tell them that you don't have some mechanism for forecasting, something that you can use to help plan out your business and plan out operations. That just wouldn't fly in this day and age. And with the advent of computer technology and the advances in software that we have, there's really no excuse for it. So, this is one of those areas that you're going to find in a bunch of different domains, not only as far as quantitative techniques are concerned, but also disciplines, right? We have forecasting requirements in strategy. We have it in economics, finance, accounting, you name it. It's a big part of the world we live in. And if you're going to be an effective decision maker, you need to have some fluency with this material. Now, a lot of what we do in this class in particular is quantitative. We will talk about some qualitative techniques shortly, but the thing about it is, this is a science, but it's also an art, and intuition plays a huge part. We've already discussed the fact that some situations you don't have data, historical data to make a prediction on. You're going to have to get creative. You're going to have to use logic. You're going to have to fill in some gaps where you don't have information. And it cannot be overemphasized that intuition, that creativity, that logic plays a big part in forecasting techniques. Even when we have data and we can use some of these sophisticated quantitative techniques, the interpretation is not always crystal clear, right? There is some judgment and there is some level of subjectivity there that we need to be aware of. So definitely, practice this. Look for other people that have engaged in these activities and try to learn from them, and understand that there's not always going to be a correct answer out to 3 decimal places, right? Some of it is going to be estimation, some is going to be expert opinion, and that's okay. And then finally, I think the textbook does a good job of warning us, number one, that the use of quantitative techniques sometimes will meet some resistance in the organization that we're applying them. This category of quantitative analysis, forecasting generally, provides a good opportunity for the analyst or the expert to collaborate and cooperate with the folks that they're doing the forecast for. It's very important to understand the context and the conditions in which we're making the forecast, And the best way to do that is to talk to the people that will be using the information, right? Let them know what you're trying to do. Talk to them about the pros and cons of a particular technique, the limitations. Talk to them about the opportunities, but then listen to them when they give you information, right? When they tell you that, maybe last month or the month before last, the inventory numbers or the sales numbers or the production numbers were not usual, right? There was something else going on, something that's not necessarily captured in the equations, but is substantively important to what you're trying to do. Establish those good relationships, work with each other, and use all the information available to try to make a better forecast. This is a good way to build some goodwill and some socialization with everybody throughout the organization. And so it's very important that you do that to the best of your ability. Now, we've talked about the fact that sometimes there is limitations to the quantitative approach to forecasting. And our textbook discusses qualitative approaches, but it doesn't give it near as much time as the quantitative aspects that we look at. Now, I have looked across several resources and have several textbooks and different treatments in my personal library, and they all point to the same thing, and that is qualitative approaches in forecasting are extremely important. Okay, not only do they give you an opportunity to avoid those situations where you don't have the quantitative means to make a forecast, and gives you another opportunity. They also provide that element of intuition that can be very, very important. Now, there are multiple qualitative approaches. The Render It All textbook talks about 4, and they vary in complexity and in the requirements for time and resources. Now, obviously, if you're a larger organization or you have the resources and the time, you would go with something like a Delphi method, which is an iterative process where you go back and forth between groups of experts and end users and things like that, and try to triangulate a forecast. That's a very powerful and very effective method. And it's a very popular method. It's well known out in practice. But it is kind of time consuming and it's resource intensive. So keep that in mind. Some of the others rely heavily on subjective judgment, right? The jury of executive opinion and the Salesforce composite, those areas, you are relying on an individual's expertise. Now, obviously, some people have some really exquisite expertise, and it can give you a very clear understanding of what your business is going to do, how a product will hit, all these different things. You can also talk to your salespeople who are your frontline workers in interacting with customers, and they'll often have a good idea of what customers want and how they'll react to a new product or service. But again, it's still an opinion, and so that needs to be kept in mind. And then finally, you can always just go straight to the consumer and ask them, right? That's a consumer market survey. You just send out a mailer and say, listen, how likely are you to purchase this product or service? And that can be a very good approach. It can provide you with a lot of good information. Keep in mind, though, it's very hard for somebody to answer something that they don't know anything about, right? If you had thought about the iPod when it first came out, and you went out to the consumers and said, listen, I'm going to give you a tiny rectangle that can play 1,000 songs. Well, some are going to be skeptical that you can deliver on that promise. Others, their experience with albums and tapes and CDs was so foreign to that concept that they wouldn't know how to react. So, there's pros and cons with everything, but it's very important that you don't discount qualitative approaches in general. Okay. If you're launching a new market or service, if you're starting a new business and you don't have any historical data on which to do a calculation, this is basically the only choice you have, right? And some measure of forecasting, some ability to plan is always better than none at all. So for those of you that are interested, some of you are just not quantitatively inclined. These are very, very good methods, and they're very effective methods. So be sure that you give them a fair chance. Now, we're going to talk a lot about quantitative approaches in this module, and the Render It All text does a good job of showing us some clear examples of calculations and the results and how to interpret them. One thing that I would point out, one of the really powerful forecasting techniques is regression, right? And we've already studied regression. We've got some background and some understanding of those techniques. If I was going to choose just one technique that I was really going to take a deep dive into, it would probably be regression, right? Because it is so flexible, because there are so many different flavors of it, so many different things that you can do, and so many different things that you can model. That's a good way to get some extra practice or some overlap in content, right? Regression is a very powerful tool and something that you should take a look at. The other time series models, the moving averages, the exponential smoothing, and what have you, those are not terribly complicated calculations. And when you're dealing with smaller data sets and some things that are fairly straightforward, those are powerful tools to incorporate information from decision making. So please give them a shot. We will find that there is different situations that are more appropriate than others for different techniques. You'll also find that the current state of art in technology and software provides for some really powerful tools, right? But these are the foundational elements. A lot of the more complicated and complex techniques rely on this logic and this quantitative approach. But keep in mind that, we're obviously not going to do very many things. We're not going to calculate them by hand. And some of the new computer approaches will do a lot of the things like choosing alphas and betas for us automatically and in response to the data. So a lot of the things that we need to understand are not so much so that we can do the calculation, but so we can troubleshoot the computer output that we're going to receive. So even if you realize, or even if you're already a more sophisticated user in this, it's helpful to get a good understanding of these basic elements, because it'll make you a better artist as far as forecasting is concerned, number one. Number two, it will help you troubleshoot and point out problematic outcomes and output for these techniques. Now, that's sort of the conceptual background that's the things that I want you to be thinking about as you go through this material and as you reflect on the chapter that you just read. Forecasting in particular, of all the quantitative analysis techniques that we have covered or that we will cover, really have a good home in business analytics. So if this was a class in pure business analytics, most business analytics textbooks have sophisticated chapters on forecasting. I've got a couple of examples for you of other textbooks that you can look at that have sort of that data processing capability and have some modules on forecasting. This Albright and Winston text, I believe this is a Cengage product. It's got some really nice material in there. It's got the additional topics and coverage of business analytic techniques, but it's got the forecasting in there that is helpful as well. That's a good one to check out. It's in print. And then this Evans business analytics text, it does a good job. It's something that I refer to on from time to time, and it has some good content in it as well. So if you're interested in the academic, the textbook type treatment of forecasting, check out some business analytics texts. I've given you a couple of examples of ones that I have in my library that I like. That can be very, very helpful. And to be fair, each textbook will pick certain things, particularly when you start looking at some of the seasonal models. There's a wide variety of approaches to decomposition, and different texts will have different approaches. And so the more resources you have, the more likely you're able to find something that is appropriate to your particular situation. And it's always good to have a little bit of variability and flexibility in your approach. Now, for those that are not as inclined for the textbook treatment, there is a ton of practitioner-oriented forecasting literature out there. Some are very much textbook-like. Others are very popular press-like treatments that provide a lot more dialogue and a lot more conceptual development and they're not as technically based. One list that I found fairly helpful is from Book Authority. They have collated a fairly extensive list of forecasting books that have some popularity either among decision makers or academics. So if you're looking for a one-stop shop where you can look for a more practitioner-oriented treatment of forecasting, this is a good list to check out. I provided the web address and a screenshot of the front page of this website. A lot of different books here, a lot of different content, can be very, very helpful. So those of you that are looking for less of an academic treatment and more of a mechanical approach to how I'm going to do this in an actual organization, you should be able to find several pieces in here that would be helpful for you. All right, so that's sort of the background. I hope I've given you some things to think about, some things to process as you start practicing using these techniques. Definitely, give the diligence to the qualitative and the quantitative approaches. Make sure that you're giving those both fair play. If you're looking for additional resources, check it out. There's a lot of things that are out there that can help you on your way when you're dealing with forecasting. Keep in mind that forecasting techniques, like we mentioned, is an expectation now. If you come out of an MBA program or a business school and you don't have at least some fluency with forecasting techniques, that will raise some eyebrows. So definitely be sure that you can at least speak on a basic level with some of this stuff. All right, good luck.